All right. I think we should jump into this. It's about that time. So there may be a few more folks joining us, but welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and ask everyone to mute themselves unless you're one of the speakers this evening. And my name is Sarah Gladue. I am the Education Director for Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust. Really wonderful to have you all joining us for Saving Seabirds with Don Lyons and also Stephen Kress. So thank you for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to be recording this, so we will share it with all of you. Should you like to view it later or share the link with other folks who would like to see it, it will be on our website, but you'll receive an email about it as well. And so we are recording from here on out. And we'll encourage folks to use the chat, which you can generally find by scrolling down. You're probably all pros at using Zoom by now, but just in case, you just put your cursor down at the bottom or up at the top of your screen and find the chat and click on that. And then if you have a question or a comment that you want us to pay attention to at some point during the presentation, most likely at the very end, we will go through the chat comments and questions and read them to the presenters and get responses at that point. So we'll keep ourselves muted just so we don't have interruptions with a big group. And I think that will probably take us into the next thing here. So I'd like to introduce folks. Dr. Stephen Kress is the now retired but founder of Project Puffin. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's really a pleasure. And I've known Steve for a little while, and he's always been really generous in sharing all sorts of information and his knowledge with folks around here, including people at Coastal Rivers Day Camp, the kids, and all sorts of other avenues connecting with the public here. And I'm also pleased to offer an opportunity to, it's actually my first time meeting Dr. Don Lyons. He's I have to pull up his bio here, or I don't remember the full title. He's the Director of Conservation Science for Audubon, it's Seabird Institute and the National Audubon Society. And so I'm sure they're going to tell us all about their works. That's why we're here. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Steve take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's always fun to share this story, but especially so with the coastal rivers, because after all, these rivers feed right into the story in so many ways that, that we have to we get past our introductory soundscape there. Those were laughing gulls, by the way, if you were wondering. As you would hear them off, let's say, the Hardy Boat, if you were close to Eastern Egg Rock, you can't miss that background sound. So yes, coastal rivers, you know, it's all about the rivers and the estuary effect of Muscongas Bay and the bird islands being just far enough out to sea that they are safe places for the birds to nest. I'd like to start this kind of story with some history, personal history, if you will, in that when I first came to Maine as a young naturalist from Central Ohio, it was Hog Island that brought me to Maine. And Hog Island is such a special spot. It brings people from all over the country and continues to do this since 1936. People have come here to learn about birds and natural history. And in 1969, I was one of the select leaders of this group that came to Hog Island to share what I knew about birds. But honestly, coming from Central Ohio, I had a very narrow window of knowledge about this area. And what I was able to sort of glean background information to share with the campers at that time. The adult campers, most of which were teachers that lived all over the country, they had, their ears wide open, and they were eager to have me tell us about the birds, like this black guillemot chick in my hand. And I knew quite a bit, but it was mostly from reading the histories. And one chapter of this history, bird history, was well known in the Audubon circles, and that was the plume hunting period. Most people think about plume hunting as something that happened in Florida, where the egrets were slaughtered to decorate ladies' hats, like this lady. But it wasn't just the egrets; it was gulls and terns and land birds as well. Things as like pileated woodpeckers and hummingbirds were all attached to ladies' hats back in the 1800s, and this greatly impacted the birds. I told people about this. I told people how all the birds really were lost along the Maine coast. Small birds, big birds, all together. It was a devastating period. By 1900, only a couple of pairs of puffins were left on the entire state of Maine. They used to live on about 6 different islands, but they were only remaining 1 or 2 pairs out on Matinicus Rock, this photograph here of this venerable lighthouse, and that only because there were light keepers there to protect them. The earliest wardens were hired by Audubon and its predecessor organizations as early as 1900. These were the first bird sanctuaries in the U.S., by the way, these outer islands along the Maine coast. By 1916, the birds were protected, but the damage had been done, and they were largely gone. Now, when I took people on trips out to Eastern Egg Rock from the Audubon camp, this remote island was about 8 miles from Hog Island, and we would circle around it and see that it was treeless, that there were boulders all over it. But the birds that were there then were gulls. And I just thought that was the natural state of things until I discovered in a book in the Hog Island Library that, in fact, puffins once nested here. I had seen them on Machias Seal Island on the Canadian border, and I'd spent some nights among them. And I thought, what a terrible loss this was. Perhaps there was something I could do. And so I thought it would be just a few summers of work to try to help bring them back, and it's turned into much of a lifetime career, actually, trying to bring them back. They used to nest under the boulders on Egg Rock, but people hunted them for food and for feathers. I learned as much as I could about puffins with the hopes to come up with a restoration plan. I learned that puffin chicks, there's only 1 chick per pair. The chick is deep under the rocks or in a soil burrow. I learned that the chick is fed by both parents, and then at fledging age, it heads out to sea by itself. That was about all that was known. Oh, one other important fact, the young chicks typically come back and nest at their hatching island, joining the colonies where their parents raised them. But once the colonies were gone, there was no history left. There was no population left with a memory of the place. Puffins were gone from Maine, and they had not come back to any of the historic islands. The little colony on Matinicus Rock, however, had continued to increase. And that gave me some encouragement that there was still enough food in the area. But how does one go about starting a new colony? How do you revive a colony after it's lost? That was the question that I kept thinking about. What can you do? So I came up with this plan. It later became known as Project Puffin. The idea was to move young puffins from Newfoundland to Maine. And to do that, we had to become the parents of the puffins. We were the surrogate parents that lived on the islands. Puffin parents, remember, raise their chick by bringing food. They feed it several times a day. They drop the food in the burrow entrance, and then they leave. Or at least that's what I thought was happening. And so we came up with this plan to collect puffin chicks in Newfoundland, to hand raise them on Egg Rock. This is a picture of the first camp that was built out there in 1974. on this very windswept place. It was like climbing to the top of Mount Everest and putting up an expedition campsite. The early tents blew down, and it really was an extreme environment for sure. But over the years, 1974 to 86, we moved a total of 2,000 puffin chicks to Eastern Egg Rock um, and to Seal Island, another colony where the program continued in Penobscot Bay in later years. 1,000 chicks went to Egg Rock. They were hand reared in burrows after taking them out of the carrying case. Thawed fish, little chicks, metamorphosed from those fluffy little ones to a fledgling age bird. And here's the 6-week-old chick. And we banded them at this age, and then they headed to sea. Now, years went by after we started this with no sign of any success. We had fledged hundreds of puffin chicks, all pretty successfully. The chicks were growing up and fledging at a greater rate than they would have in Newfoundland if we'd left them there, because in those days, about half of the chicks were being eaten by gulls in Newfoundland. So the chicks had a better chance actually by coming to Maine, but where were they going and why didn't they come back to Egg Rock? Nobody knew how long it would take. That was one obstacle. But after waiting from 1973 to 1977 without seeing anything for 4 years, we figured we needed to do something different. And so we started putting up decoys to serve as kind of like welcoming committees. Now, the idea here was that puffin chicks normally come back to an existing colony, but without any parents there, would they even come ashore and explore the rocks? That was my question. And we discovered an answer to that right away. We put up decoys in 1977, and immediately we started seeing puffins at the island. Was it a coincidence, or was it all about the decoys? It's hard to know, but the good news was that they were there, and they were carrying leg bands on their legs. This is one of the original puffins that came back. It had a white leg band. It told us it was 2 years old, and it flew in and landed with the decoys, looked at them very close up, nuzzled with them, picked at them, and then flew away, which it was terrific. It was there, but we were worried when they left, wondering maybe they were scared off by these decoys. It's hard to know what a bird thinks, really. You can only describe the behavior you see. And that's why we used mirrors the following year to try to make a greater attraction. A mirror would provide a reflective surface. And as anybody knows has seen a robin or a catbird or cardinal fluttering against a reflection in your home mirror or window or hubcap or car mirror, puffins do the same thing, not fluttering against it, but seeing their reflection and looking at it, trying to figure out what's going on. And over the next several years, now I'm fast forwarding to 1980, we saw increasing numbers at Egg Rock of puffins. We still put decoys out, by the way. If you go on a boat trip and watch for puffins, beware of one-legged puffins because those are still decoys. We've never put a puffin out with 2 legs that I know of. If you see one with 2 legs or it's walking or flying, of course, that's the real thing. 1981, on the 4th of July, is still a day we celebrate. And this coming summer will be the 40th anniversary of the 4th of July on Egg Rock. It was a very special event when the puffins first came back to Egg Rock. And nested for the first time and raised the first chick. It was special not just because it finally, 8 years after we started the project, it was not only personally gratifying, but that was the whole beginning, the verification that it was even possible to restore a colony of seabirds. Nobody had done it before. I hadn't realized when I started this that this was such an unusual thing to do, that if any success here was really special because it proves that one could not only wipe out seabird colonies, people could restore them. And that continues to give me a thrill to think about that, and that we were there to pilot this. Well, what's happened since those early years? Since 1981, when we had 5 pairs breed, the colony has continued to increase. There was a long period where it was stuck at about 15 pairs. And then in the early 2000s, it began to rapidly increase. And the numbers have continued to increase in the most recent years. So this is all good news. That other colony that I mentioned before at Seal Island, the other 1,000 pairs, has done an even more spectacular increase. It also took 8 years using these same methods of bringing chicks from Newfoundland, hand rearing them, a very slow process. It took 8 years there too to get the first chicks, again, about 5 pairs. And then that colony has grown by the hundreds of pairs. The fact that this colony has leveled out, I think, is more a result of the fact that it's increasingly difficult to count the numbers of pairs. Once you get over 500 pairs, and the only way you know you have another pair is to see where the birds are dropping in with fish. And that's a big island, and the birds are increasing all over it. So we're kind of limited at 500 on a graph like this, but I think that the colony there probably has far exceeded this by now. So over all the years of doing this, I have sort of puzzled about several key questions. And one question I have is, why didn't the puffins naturally return to Egg Rock? After all, the plume hunting had stopped in 1916. And here it was in 1969, it was a gull colony. There was no sign of puffins coming back to Egg Rock or any other island. What is it about some species that keeps them from coming back? In the meantime, herring gulls and blackback gulls and even black guillemots were repopulating islands all along the coast. What's with puffins? Why wouldn't they do it? Part of it goes back to this idea of natal, what's called natal philopatry, this tendency for chicks to return home to the place where they hatched. It's a good idea because if you go back to an island where it was safe enough to produce you, then you're most likely to be able to produce your young, and they will have a better chance rather than risking breeding at a new site that could have predators or lack of fish or something else. So many kinds of birds have this behavior of returning home, and they're very reluctant to start new colonies. In fact, if you look at all the endangered species of seabirds around the world, and there were many of them, by some estimates, about a third of the world's seabirds are vulnerable to extinction presently. Most of those are these philopatric species. They don't have many islands to breed on, and they're very faithful to coming home. Contrast that to those birds that came back to the main islands, like herring gulls. They're quick to colonize new islands, and they lay more eggs. They lay 2 to 3 eggs. They can nest on the surface of islands. Not every island has enough rock crevices as places to breed like Egg Rock does. Not every island has enough deep soil to burrow into in Maine. Our soils are very thin by comparison to Newfoundland, where we were collecting the chicks. But gulls can nest anywhere as long as they're far enough from predators. And gull populations took advantage of the new protection they received from the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. While the puffins were reluctant to start new colonies, shy about going off on their own, the gulls didn't mind at all. They took over island. This is a picture of Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge, the second puffin restoration site, when we first started the project there, when the whole island had been taken over by large populations of gulls. Now, it wasn't just the gulls' breeding behavior that was different. There were other things going on. First of all, they can eat whatever they want to eat. They eat little fish. They can eat plankton. They can eat other birds. This gull is chasing a puffin into its burrow. In fact, burrow nesting in puffins probably evolved to keep them safe from gulls. They live with gulls and they have lots of behaviors. The nocturnal fledging of chicks, probably a gull deterrent behavior. But the world of the gulls and the puffins was also being impacted by things humans were doing on this coast. And Don will talk to you more about our recent research with fish later, but let me just point out that fish populations have been devastated on the coast. Maybe this group knows that. A lot of people don't know that. But this picture of fisher people out on Matinicus Island in 1900 says to me, there used to be a lot of small fish in the ocean for birds to eat. We still see it in the rivers. Some of you know about the new alewife runs, locks up at the Bristol Mills, terrific, and Damascotta Mills. It's that time of year, the fish are starting to come up the rivers, but these are exceptions. Gulls once had lots of food to feed on, but not so much anymore. These dams that are on Maine rivers are a plague to the fish. This is a map that shows the dams on the Penobscot River alone. There's over 200 of them. Some of them, yes, some of them have fishways around them, but most of them have been blocked. And so this is like cholesterol in our arteries, stopping the movement, the circulation. This is the natural life of Maine, and its coastal waters was dramatically affected by these dams. And the puffins and their foods were also affected. There's other things going on affecting things that I did not realize when I started my what now in retrospect was a naive project to reinsert puffins back when the gull population was so advantaged. Most herring these days goes into lobster bait. And those herring gulls were still eating herring, but they're getting it now as bait. Over 90% of the herring population is caught every year and is served up as lobster bait. And the gulls have also benefited, not as much now as back in the late 60s and 70s when Project Puffin started, but coastal dumps like this were just a few wing flaps away from Egg Rock, and we would find gull pellets filled full of aluminum and saran wrap and pork chop bones and all kinds of things tossed up that were coming out to the island, proof that the gulls had it easy. Another question that I've wondered about with this Project Puffin over the years is, are these colonies sustainable? What's it going to take to keep puffins on Egg Rock moving forward? If they didn't come back on their own and it took this heavy lift to get them there reestablished, what's going to keep them there? That's when I started thinking about tern attraction and tern restoration. Terns nest on the surface. They're highly aggressive toward gulls. And if you can get a big colony of terns established, I thought maybe they could be the long-term solution to the sustainability of puffins. Perhaps what we needed to get the kind of balance back, if you will, was to try to get the terns back and that they would take care of the puffins. We know that they can chase away a gull, even the great blackback gull. Enough terns can chase them off. In fact, even bald eagles can be chased off by terns. So maybe the puffins lived under an umbrella of terns. So we set out trying to create that umbrella of terns. But the terns had disappeared from Egg Rock by about 1936. The first Audubon campers talked about terns. And shortly after the camp started, it was the end, and the gulls took over. Trying to use the same methods that proved helpful for the puffins, we put out tern decoys, and we played tern calls. We tried to avoid the alarm calls like this. The alarm call is something that tells the tern chicks to hide, and it it's not if you're trying to attract terns in the first place, probably not a good approach. So we played instead this call. What's this call? And when we played the right sounds, it turned out that the terns responded like this. They would start offering food to the decoys. And terns had not landed on Egg Rock for decades, but all of a sudden, by playing sounds and putting out decoys, they came and they displayed to the decoys. Even these stylized decoys, these kind of block-headed decoys, these sort of essence of tern models. It didn't take a whole lot to be attractive to the terns. And they would nest just inches away from the decoys and the sound. If the sound went off, that was like an alarm call, and the birds would disappear. And equally exciting, we attracted not just common terns, but we attracted roseate terns as well, an endangered species. And eventually, laughing gulls came. So we had restored this whole community, 3 species of terns, common Arctic roseate terns and laughing gulls, because we had displaced the gulls and attracted these other birds back. We displaced the gulls by taking their eggs and by scaring them off, the herring gulls. Occasionally, shooting a rifle in their direction was a reminder that they better nest somewhere else. And remember, there were 300 islands in Maine where gulls were nesting, but there was hardly any other places for terns. The terns were largely missing by the time we started doing this in the 1980s. And island by island, we have used this recipe of displacing the gulls, putting interns living in field camps on the islands throughout the nesting season, using decoys and sound recordings, and all of these field stations now exist in Maine. Are they sustainable? Was this the solution for puffins? Well, it is a solution for building the tern population back up. Look how low they were along the Maine coast when this project first started. And now they are up to 8,000 pairs of some of these common Arctic terns. Is it sustainable? Can we leave? What happens? Well, it's one of the sobering realities here is that the gulls are back first at the beginning of the year. They don't migrate nearly as far as the terns. The terns migrate to the southern hemisphere. Arctic terns famously go to Antarctica for the winter. So the gulls get a head start. And the gulls will keep the terns off if we're not there. The term conservation reliant species is a term, if it's new to you, it will be a term you'll increasingly hear about, because more and more species of wildlife, not just seabirds, but wildlife of all kinds, are becoming conservation reliant. At coastal rivers properties where you have bobolinks nesting, it's another good example of a conservation reliant species. They wouldn't be there unless we do the right things. And these terns would no longer nest in Maine without us doing the right thing. I'm convinced of it. Sustainability means, at the short term at least, it means keeping these field biologists living on the islands during the nesting season. Even one season, when they're not there, the gulls will be back. And now the eagles will be back with them. We tried one year to put up a decoy research assistant. I figured if the decoys work for terns and puffins, why not serve as a research? So we had these Cornell robotics engineers help us create this robot that would lay down in a box and randomly pop up. It was solar powered, and we thought we were really smart until the gull started landing on its head to get a better view of the island. They were not at all convinced this was a threat, even though we dressed it up like our real interns. So the interns continue to live on Egg Rock. they continue to have a role there. And if we take them off any of these islands on the coast, I think we're going to lose these species that we've worked so hard to bring back. New roles, new jobs for these interns have evolved. Don will tell you more about those later on. But let me mention a couple more things about Project Puffin, because it has gone global beyond my wildest imaginations. We knew that these birds were global and that where they migrated to. These maps of the travels of Arctic terns from Egg Rock are a vivid example of how the Maine coast is connected to the rest of the world. There's nothing better that I know of that shows the connectivity as the migrations of birds. Here's another map that I'm going to show you in a moment, that now showing how conservation can move from one place to another as well. The Seabird Restoration Database is a global project funded by these sponsors and cooperators that is showing that the methods developed on Eastern Egg Rock originally have now spread to all these other locations around the world. Not because we have gone there and done the work, although I'm happy to say I went to a few of these personally. Most of these projects, they're the people that have heard about the work we did in Maine, but now there's 600 conservation projects in at least 25 countries. This project is trying to find them all. And I think this is probably just the beginning of what they're discovering. Behind each of these spots on the map is a conservation hero, somebody that has dedicated much of their life to year after year going out and doing the kinds of hands-on conservation work that we're doing on the islands along the Maine coast. Some of this is possible because other people have lent their special skills. This is Jim Henry's original Seabird Conservation Workshop in Waitsfield, Vermont. It has moved to Maine. It's now in Bremen and our facility there on the mainland opposite Hog Island. Jim Henry was the founder of Mad River Canoe, and he used the methodology there to invent a really rugged, solid decoy making process. And here's Sue Schubel, the new manager of what's now called Mad River Decoys by Audubon. And we make these decoys and hand paint them and ship them all over the world. And other tools as well, like reflective mirrors that are helping others on these projects. I'll show you just a couple of these projects. In the Galapagos Islands, there was a project to bring back the endangered Galapagos petrel. They live in volcanoes, but their problem is that the chicks were being dug out of the burrows by feral dogs and rats. Sound speakers like this help attract the birds into artificial burrows. Hopefully, a fence will someday enclose this restored colony. This was the first use of our techniques outside of Maine. But another benefit of this project, and there's Jerry Skinner with the two first international interns that came to Maine to help us, and at the same time to learn about the work that we do. And now we have an international program bringing young biologists from all over Maine, from all over the world. At least 16 countries now have come to Maine and worked on those seabird sanctuaries and taken their methods back home to help other seabirds. Devil's Slide Rock is another exciting project that we worked on using our methods. This is south of San Francisco. An oil spill there in 1986 smeared heavy crude oil all along the coast, all the way from San Francisco to Southern California. This is what Devil's Slide Rock looked like before the oil spill. And after the spill, there was no birds there. And they didn't nest for 10 years until an ambitious project started to put up decoys. And those decoys, the same year they went up, lured back murres to the rock. And now there's the pre-colony before the oil spill, and there it is as it looks now. You can't even tell the difference. There's just a brief video of showing some of the action of the birds coming and going. It's very exciting. On this project, they don't have to have people living on the island. In this case, once the restoration is finished, they could pack up the decoys, and the colony has continued to thrive on its own. Another project that's underway now in China is working with the most endangered seabird in the world. It's the Chinese crested tern, where egg collecting and plastics and rats and cyclones are a big problem. The bird was thought to be extinct for 70 years, but now several dozen pairs are thriving in protected colonies like Egg Rock. Here was the collecting seabird eggs for sale in markets was part of the problem. Plastics. Giant snakes were swimming out until two young Chinese biologists put up these decoys mounted onto cement blocks. And immediately the decoys attracted terns. Watch carefully. Oops. Watch carefully, and you'll see here's how a tern likes to decoy. They have to keep doing things out there, just like we do in Maine, and hauling gravel, building retainer walls, monitoring this carefully. The future of this is just as sustainable or not as sustainable as our tern colonies in Maine, but their government funding is making a difference and a commitment. The bird has become like a national treasure there, and the Chinese are very proud of this project. It's gotten a lot of press. Unlike in our country, projects like Project Puffin are funded completely from the private, almost completely from the private sector. This is the good news for the Chinese crested tern. Lots of little fluffy chicks are hatching as I tell this story. I get emails daily from the biologists living on the islands, just like our biologists are living on islands, telling me about the day-to-day counts of these Chinese crested terns. Well, there's been a lot here to share, and I've just given you some highlights, but there's a lot more to this story now, and I want to switch screens now. Don is going to pick up the story here because the new role of the interns that are living on the islands is, I think, is a very compelling story, and I want to turn it over now to Don. Both of us will be back at the end to answer any questions that you have. So I'm going to stop the share.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. What I want to touch on, and I think you guys should all be able to see my screen now. Looks good. I kind of want to pick up on some of our more recent work here in coastal Maine, and kind of a mild shift in focus. Kind of one thing that Steve's done so well is restore colonies and really focus on protecting birds at their nesting islands, which is of course a critical step in their conservation. But we also need to be mindful of their access to food in the ocean around these nesting islands. And that's something that Steve became interested in long ago and directed interns to start collecting data about what puffins and terns and other seabirds here eat. And we're now working to translate some of those long-term data sets into information that can really help natural resource managers manage fisheries and ocean resources in more sustainable ways that both benefit seabirds and really benefit the entire ocean ecosystem. So I'll start with a, a crisis, a threat that we're all aware of. Climate change is certainly a looming, growing problem in every ecosystem on Earth. And the oceans are some of the most impacted ecosystems, including those here off our coast. And this figure really highlights how climate change is really significantly impacting the Gulf of Maine, our waters right off the state of Maine. You can see the blue line in this figure is kind of the gradual increase or gradual warming in ocean temperatures around the world. And it's pretty gradual over the decades shown in this figure, the last 40 years or so. You can see, however, that things in the Gulf of Maine have been a little more turbulent, and in the last decade especially, much warmer than the temperature increases around the world. If you look at that map in the upper left, the red areas indicate the areas of most rapid warming, and you can see that the area off the northeast US and the Atlantic Canada coastline are among the reddest, the most rapidly warming locations in the global ocean. So we have a significant challenge here in our region. Our region being the Gulf of Maine, this is just a picture of both the Gulf, the ocean environment, and the watershed that flows into the Gulf, shown here in green, encompassing several states and provinces in Canada, of course, Maine being the biggest chunk of that. But looking at a little bigger scale, we can start to understand why the Gulf of Maine is warming so rapidly. Here in this figure, the Gulf of Maine is over in the lower left. And this figure does a nice job of showing some of the currents, ocean currents, that flow into the Gulf and really impact how warm or cool it is. Traditionally, the Gulf of Maine has been dominated by cold water that's flowed down from Canada and into the Gulf at the northeast edge. But in more recent years, we've seen significant changes in the Gulf Stream, that the Gulf Stream has moved further north, and much more warm water from the Gulf Stream is spiraling into the Gulf of Maine and really heating it rapidly. That's a big reason why the Gulf of Maine is heating faster than other places in the ocean. It's this change in current flows that's been happening in recent years. So that presents really significant changes to the ecosystem, and from the perspective of puffins, from the fish that exist in the Gulf of Maine. And people are spending a fair amount of time studying how fish are responding to warming temperatures. And for us, there's kind of two overriding observations. The first is that many species of fish are moving north or northeast along our coast. This map on the right shows a trend for white hake, which is a pretty important fish for puffins and other seabirds in our region. And you can see that numbers of white hake sampled in fisheries surveys have been decreasing, this blue shade to the south of us, and actually increasing a bit in portions of the Gulf of Maine. That red area is a little bit of an increase in this species in the entire Gulf of Maine. The other big effect warming, especially warming at the surface, has on fish is that to stay in the temperature range that they like to be in, fish will often move deeper in the water column. And so surveys have indicated that they're more often captured at deeper depths. And that impacts seabirds in a couple different ways. Seabirds nest on particular islands. As Steve alluded, puffins are very faithful to the islands where they were raised and begin nesting. So they're really constrained as far as where they can go to find fish while they're nesting. And then birds do need to breathe air. They are limited in how deep they can dive. Puffins typically do not dive deeper than about 50 feet. Other species like terns and gulls are really surface feeders and rarely get any fish more than a foot or two deep in the water. So the last thing I want to draw your attention to on that map there is that circled area, and that's the Maine coast. And that's where our seabird nesting islands are. And you can actually see a little bit of blue there, that this species, white hake, which is an important seabird food, it is decreasing close to the shore. We're seeing this species both move away from shore and probably deeper into the water. And that's making it more difficult for puffins and terns and other species to find and catch these birds while they're nesting and sort of chained to their nesting islands during the middle of the summer. So to gather kind of the impacts of these changes in fish populations to study that, we've really directed our Seabird intern staff that staff the 7 field stations that we work at each summer to really pay attention to what seabirds are eating. And they typically do that while sitting in a small blind, using binoculars or a camera to photograph the fish that birds are carrying. And then while living on the island, they're also data processing and both entering data and reviewing those data, summarizing it, and presenting to the scientific community here in the Gulf of Maine what the results are at the end of each summer. So a really critical role in long-term conservation for these seabirds, in addition to kind of the day-to-day needs of chasing off eagles or the large predatory gulls. So a few foods really stand out as important. And probably the most important isn't any surprise. Atlantic herring are a fish of choice for lobster fishers to use as bait. They really are a superfood for many species in the ecosystem, including puffins, our terns, and other seabirds. So certainly how herring go will dictate the future of seabirds in our region. It's not the only superfood. The white hake that I alluded to earlier is also a really high quality food. And when it's available, puffins and terns can raise chicks very successfully. But not all the foods puffins are using in recent years are all that great. There's certainly junk food from a seabird's perspective as well, for a variety of reasons. These photos show a few, like butterfish, which is the very large and very deep-bodied or tall fish that you see the puffin on the left holding. There's sticklebacks, which are quite a small fish without much of any body fat. And there's northern pufferfish, which are also not very nutritious. And these fish pose challenges for seabirds for a variety of reasons, whether they're perhaps not very nutritious, or in the case of butterfish, they are not a bad fish all in all, but one that's really deep-bodied, as I mentioned. Whoops. And really difficult for chicks to consume. here's a little puffin chick trying its darndest to eat that really deep butterfish and struggling. And when it can't, that means it's a wasted trip by the parent. It's a period of time when that chick is going to go hungry. And so just a real loss, all in all. So butterfish are not a good prey type for seabirds to be feeding their chicks. They're also a warm water species. So they're an indicator that conditions are warming, and typically there isn't that much other fish around at times when adult seabirds are forced to rely on butterfish. But there are some really good news around fish as well. A relatively new fish in the diet for seabirds that we've seen is haddock, young haddock. And when these data were first collected, haddock were not seen very commonly at all. But in recent years, they've become, in some recent years, they've become the major prey type for puffins and terns. And so they're filling a really important need at times when herring or other of the superfoods are not available. And haddock are available because we've done a pretty good job managing them. We've helped that species come back from historic lows 20 or 30 years ago. And now they're widely harvested for our food. Much of the fish and chips that folks eat here are haddock. And so when a fish is well managed, we can both rely on it for our own needs, and puffins can rely on it for their needs as well. So there is hope that we can help the birds by better managing fish. And this is an example of haddock getting delivered to a puffin chick. And you can see how quickly that chick can wolf down that meal. So that's a really productive feeding, a really successful session for that adult, a foraging session. So kind of as a direct measure of the impacts of temperature, we've been studying a particular nest where we have a web camera going. You can find it at explore.org. And in the summer of 2018, we had a really graphic example of the effects of warm temperatures. This orange line in this figure is the sea surface temperature. And you can see that the last week of July and the first week or two of August were really warm, really peak temperatures at that time. The blue bars here are the number of times the chick Grace was fed each day by both parents. And you can see when temperatures were really warm, those feedings really dropped off. The parents were really struggling to find enough food to bring it back and feed those chicks or their chick. So a really direct observation of how sea surface temperature, ocean warming, seems to impact the ability of puffins and other seabirds to find food for their chicks. You can see that Grace during the heat wave was skinny, lightweight, not thriving. But after that heat wave was over, the parents were really heroic, did an amazing job compensating for that earlier lack of food, and produced a fat and thriving chick. Not all parents can do that. Grace was very fortunate to have very skilled and experienced parents that were successfully able to recover once fish became more available. Not all parents were as adept as Grace is. And this is the location of our Puffin cam. It's in Burrow 59, a rather famous burrow on Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge. And that observing that burrow has brought us entirely new insight into behavior at the burrow, and some other ways, kind of indirect ways, that lack of food can impact birds. So when parents have to work really hard to find food to raise their chicks, they're gone a lot more. They're not in the burrow with the chick, kind of attending to the chick and offering it some protection. And at those times, other puffins that are not breeding can come in looking around, basically seeing if they can squat, if they can maybe take over a burrow for their use in a future year. That's what happened in this case, except the parent puffin came home, discovered this interloper, and promptly ran them off. So kind of a interesting, aggressive behavioral interaction, and kind of the absence of parents because they're working hard out foraging for their chick, can really open the door to these indirect consequences. So it's not just about feeding a chick at a high rate. These secondary effects are also important, and really amazing insight because of this camera technology. Another bit of technology that is really amazing has allowed us to track what puffins are doing when they're not at the colony. During the rest of the year, puffins are at sea, much like this bird. But the electronics technology that has developed in part due to advances in cell phone technology, actually, has allowed really new and exciting tracking of puffins year-round to see where our puffins go, and what areas are important to them outside of the breeding season. And here's the track of one bird. This bird just left the breeding island, and we're observing its movements during the fall to start, and winter. And this bird started out off the coast by quickly moving up to the coast of Labrador, spent time in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then spent time on the continental shelf off of the Gulf of Maine and off of Cape Cod. Now, we're in this animation of its track. We had a lull while it was nesting the second year at its nesting island, and then it took off for a second fall and winter's movements. And we see it visiting a lot of the same places, and certainly there's places and particular habitats that are important. I want to draw your attention in particular to those yellow, that yellow triangle and square. That's some of the most valuable habitat late in the winter. And in a real success of linking science to policy, those tracks influenced or contributed to the designation of a marine national monument, the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Monument. This area was set aside actually by President Obama shortly before he left office. And this area is now an area where fish are not commercially fished, and can be available for puffins, both within the boundaries, but even outside the boundaries of this monument. So to wrap up, we're doing a number of things to share the joy and the conservation needs of puffins and other seabirds with a whole variety of people. And there's a number of ways any of you who might be interested could engage with these birds to learn more and to potentially contribute to their conservation. I'm sure many of you, most of you, maybe all of you have taken a puffin cruise or know of the puffin cruises um, that happen along our coast. This is a boat going around Eastern Egg Rock. We also have a webcam, or a whole set of webcams actually, from Seal Island and Hog Island that are hosted by explore.org, a key partner in that effort. Of course, we offer programming at the Hog Island Audubon Camp, both 5-day long sessions, but also new this year in the early season. For the rest of May and the first half of June, we're offering daily field trips to get out on the water or out on Hog Island, do some birding or other exploration of the natural environment here. We also even have some online offerings, of course, with COVID that fit well. One of those offerings is a course that Steve and I both contribute to as lecturers, along with a couple other very well-known seabird biologists. That's the Puffin Islands Online course. We even have an expanded version. This was the expanded version was just launched at the beginning of the year. And this is a great way to learn more about seabird biology and threats and conservation as well. And this can be found at the Hog Island website there, hogisland.audubon.org. And if you're really interested in the history of the program and how it's been relevant and how it will continue to be relevant, there are a couple books which you can check out. The Project Puffin book has been out for a number of years with Steve and his co-author Derek Jackson. But new, just over the past winter, is the Puffin Plan, which is an award-winning book aimed at a somewhat younger audience, but sharing that amazing conservation story in an entirely new way. So certainly, you know, if you would like to learn more about our story, you know, check out these books, visit us online. And with that, I will conclude. And maybe the best way to learn more is just start asking us some questions.
That was outstanding, both of you. Thank you very much. It's just an amazing compilation of stories, really. So, yeah, absolutely. I'm curious what folks are thinking about and what the questions are. You're welcome to either put them in the chat, or we're a small enough group. If you want to just unmute yourself and ask your question, that's fine as well. I guess can I start with a question? Can I?
Sure.
Is that legal? I'm just curious, you know, as many of us are either connected to the fishing industry in various ways, or as consumers of fish in various ways, wondering, are there things that consumers should be thinking about related to fish and the fishing industry that will promote conservation kind of writ large, and not just of a specific fish?
Yeah, I guess I could dive in, and Steve, please add on anything I might miss. Certainly being mindful in our choices about what we consume, and being mindful that they're sustainably harvested species is a great way to contribute to the protection of seabirds and other predators. We're fortunate in Maine that fisheries like the lobster fishery, the haddock fishery, for example, are well managed. We have some successes here. We have some challenges currently as well. Certainly Atlantic herring is at a low spot in its abundance. And so kind of supporting efforts to switch to other bait, at least in the short term, near term, are important. And so those are ways that any of us can help. I mean, the restoration that's going on in rivers, we've alluded to alewife runs, expanding or growing, recovering. That's all really important as well. Those fish spend time in the ocean environment and are often good prey for seabirds. I mean, we see it regularly at the fish ladders where there's herring gulls or cormorants or other birds benefiting from alewife runs. The more we strengthen those runs, both for our own use, but also for their natural predators, um, the better. And so really supporting those kinds of restoration projects and habitat protection in freshwater environments can help, it can really help seabirds in the ocean as well, even though it seems a little ways away.
Great. Thank you for that.
I would
Did you
just
wanna-
add that, I would just add to that, that the, as far as the making the right choices for consumers, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a app that you can tell which fish, and when you're in a restaurant, are good choices or not. And so that's just a handy thing that you can tap into wherever you are.
Great. Thank you for that resource. There's a question in the chat about, do puffins have to eat the fish whole, or can the puffin break up the fish?
I can just answer that by saying that the chicks need to swallow whole, unlike ospreys that typically bring back fish that are too big for their chicks to swallow and are well adapted to tearing apart and feeding their chicks little morsels of the bigger fish. Puffins just don't have those behaviors. If you noticed in the background of that poor little puffin chick that was trying to swallow the butterfish, the adult was just sitting there in the entranceway. It had done its job to bring back the meal, and the job typically is done. It doesn't have the tools or the behavior to chop up those little fish. You'd think with a puffin's big beak, they could slice it up, but they just don't have the behavior to do that. So this is a new situation apparently that the puffin is in, where sometimes the fish is just too big.
It's a couple of excellent spot on comments about how this is such a remarkable and ongoing project. And thank you to both of you for all the work you're doing and have done and keep going. So some encouragement from the audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we can't do it without the support of, so many. So we appreciate those kind words.
Great. So what age or who is the Puffin plan directed at? That book intrigues me. I haven't seen that yet, Steve.
Yeah, it just came out this year. It's for 12-year-olds and up. And that was the idea. And just won this Ben Franklin Award, which is the gold prize from the Independent Public Publishers Association, as the best nonfiction book for teens this year. So we're very excited about that. That this story, this message of hope, this Maine-based story, is now recognized nationally, internationally. So it's made in Maine. I hope that people appreciate that unique feature of this whole story.
Oh, Alyssa has generously put in the pocket guide to sustainable seafood link. So if anybody wants to see that in the chat, go right ahead. And I'll actually pull that out later. So thank you, Alyssa, and put that in the email so that when we send out the link, you guys can all access that email directly, that link and that website directly from the email. So that's helpful. Thank you. Well, congratulations on the book, Steve, or this Puffin Plan book. That sounds wonderful. I can't wait to take a look. And
yeah,
I'll try it out.
It's available up there in the Puffin store in Rockland, which is closed at the moment, but online, the online store has them for sale. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely check it out.
Yeah. All right. More encouraging happiness coming off the chat. Many people saying thank you. It really is remarkable to hear firsthand, a conservation story of this nature from people who are involved with it, because it's it's absolutely inspirational. So um, thank
Well, I
you.
recognize a lot of names of folks that are on this call, and so thank you for you all being here and for being interested. It's such a beautiful day. So hello there. Hi, Steve Wallace, our neighbor in Maine, and Anita and others. So it's terrific to see everybody
Yeah.
tuning in for the latest. Yeah. Don is back in the neighborhood already, just arrived. I'll be up there the end of June with Alyssa and Liliana. So we're looking forward to being back. Yep.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
definitely come visit us anytime. We're at the end of Keene Neck Road. Don't be strangers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a beautiful place to take a walk too.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I think everyone's probably ready for dinner. So I really appreciate this program and all of you who joined us. And have a wonderful evening. And Steve and Don, wish you the very best in settling in back to Maine and uh, and your immediate work. That's very exciting. So thank you, everybody. Have a